I'm going to try to get started. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Lisa Tilley. I'm in the Development Studies Department here, and I'm going to pass over to my colleagues to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Hengam Eziai. I'm at the School of History, Religions and Philosophies.
Sarah Kaziz, I'm in the Politics Department.
And Samia Khatun in History, Religions and Philosophies.
We just wanted to take a quick moment to introduce the series as a whole. This is our inaugural event for 2025. This is the third round of the Histories of Capitalism and Race seminar series here at SOAS. It's an interdisciplinary collaboration between politics, development studies, and history, religions, and philosophies. And as you might know, there are many Histories of Capitalism series that have sort of popped up at various institutions worldwide. We think the one at SOAS is distinct for many reasons, but one of them is that we're trying very much to rethink concepts of capital and race from the perspectives of Asia and Africa. So we're very happy to have you join us, join this intellectual community. But before I pass over to my colleague Sarah Kazaz, I also just wanted to take a moment to thank Tanvi Kanchan as well, who has been helping us organize the series today, and also encourage you to check out the archive of our events on the website, which hopefully you can read on the whiteboard there. So yeah, we have all the videos from the last two seminar series up on the website. We also have a podcast, a student-led podcast, whereby SOAS students have interviewed the many amazing speakers that we've managed to bring here.
Yeah, so just following up on that, to say that in this incredible kind of series that we managed to put together this year, we're very thankful to the generosity of the speakers for coming. That we, we have kind of this large theme around empire, race, and capital, but we also have a few sub-themes that are going to pop up in this various books. And because we think of this as an intellectual community where we think of you as coming multiple times and thinking about these books together, we wanted to flag a couple of those themes. So for this term especially, we want some of the books will delve into questions around gender, sexuality, and how we think, how the feminism movement and perspective have shaped how we think about histories of capitalism and race. And the other theme that will come up a lot is history of ideas, political thought, and as they kind of work through the larger theme. And then in next term, actually, we're going to have another really cool series, so stay tuned for that, where we will it will turn into more of a conversation around environment, infrastructure, finance. So we do have kind of sub themes that will crop up in the different terms.
So the final thing we want to say before we get started is we want to use this opportunity to actually announce that we are working together to, in fact, launch a brand new program called an MA Race and Empire at SOAS. And this series will eventually become the intellectual home for that space. So if that's something you're interested in, if people you know are interested in, please let them know. People can get in touch with me if you want more information. We are just very excited. We're going to be all teaching on it. There's a lot of people working on race and empire and capitalism at SOAS, and it is very exciting to be able to bring everyone together like this, not only for this series, but to train future generations. Okay, with that, I think over to you, Lisa.
Great, thank you so much. I just want to add actually that this particular event is co-sponsored with the Centre for Palestine Studies. So huge thanks to the Centre for supporting and co-sponsoring. So I just want to introduce our speakers for the evening. I'm going to start with just a little anecdote, actually, because I was on my way to the station this morning to commute to London, and I thought I'd play a podcast with our speaker, Esmat Elhalaby, on the way to accompany me on my walk. And the host opened the podcast by noting that just a few hours ahead of recording their conversation, a ceasefire had been announced in Gaza. Hopefully, they said, putting an end to the violence. So Esmat, who is Palestinian with roots in Gaza, then goes on to reflect in the podcast on the soul-shaking destruction that's inflicted on Gaza by Israel, which, you know, even in a world of shocking imperial violence, has a particularly cruel and devastating quality. So that podcast, you might remember, Esmat, was actually recorded in 2021. Recorded after yet another deadly bombing campaign in Gaza. So we are really honoured to welcome Esmat on today of all days, also against the backdrop of the kind of bitter hope that this word ceasefire brings. And as the people of Gaza take their moment to celebrate on the streets. So Esmat Elhalaby is assistant professor of transnational history at the University of Toronto. And his work focuses on the transnational Middle East and South Asia. And this scholarship was recently awarded with the Amilcar Cabral Prize. And I can't think of a more fittingly named prize to honor his body of work. And of course, we're here today to hear much more about Esmat's wonderful book, Parting Gifts of Empire, Palestine and India at the Dawn of Decolonization, published with University of California Press. So following Esmat's reflections on his book this evening for around about 20 minutes, we're also going to welcome two really wonderful discussants who we're so lucky to have with us, Taha and Nivi Manchanda. So just to introduce them, Mai is Assistant Professor of Sociology at the LSE here in London. Her latest publication is titled Insurgent Social Reproduction, the Home, the Barricade and Women's Work in the 1936 Palestinian Revolution. This is a really brilliant piece of work which you can find in the journal Theory, Culture and Society. Otherwise, my wider body of work explores revolutionary, worker, feminist, and anti-colonial liberation movements in Palestine and the wider Middle East. And this body of work makes really important contributions to Marxist and feminist thought. Nivi Manchanda is professor of international politics at Queen Mary University of London. Her first book, Imagining Afghanistan, The History and Politics of Imperial Knowledge, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. It's won many awards. And her second book will be coming out very soon. And in between, she's published some brilliant and field-defining work on race, racism, and colonialism in international politics. So with that, I will hand over to Esmat to talk about his wonderful book. Thank you. Please welcome me in joining him. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for that kind introduction. I don't recommend anyone listen to that podcast. I never listened to it, so if you do, just don't tell me. Thank you all for being here. It's really an honor. My sincere thanks to Samia Khatoon, to Lisa again, to Sahar Al-Qazzaz, to Hengam Azia for their kind invitation to share my work with you all. I must say at the outset that, of course, it is impossible for me to speak today about my book without noting that it is now the 9th of October, 2025, and the present genocidal assault on Gaza has now continued for 2 years unabated. Of course, I wrote this last night, and Now we're talking about a ceasefire, but we have to remember, of course, the respite for the steadfast people of Gaza is not even the minimum demand for the Palestinians everywhere, right? The demand is return, and respite is only the beginning. And Israel has perpetrated this violence on the Palestinian people and their allies with the support of the West, including the United Kingdom. This, of course, is not just rhetorical support, but logistical coordination, diplomatic cover, and material aid, principally in the form of the export of the most advanced, deadly weaponry on this earth. These actions against Palestine have resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of people. Now, I started this project many years before October 7th, 2023, but many more years after the Nakba of 1948, or indeed the Balfour Declaration of 1918. But I finished this book very much in the midst of our present conditions, and insofar as I'm fairly pessimistic about the usefulness of our writing and research, I hope this book, which is about how colonized people sought to produce knowledge for liberation, might offer some useful lessons or warnings. Well, this book was just published last week, so I'm very grateful to those of you who have read it. I'm very grateful to May, Taha, and Nivi Manchanda for their generosity and time. And I look forward to all of your ruthless criticism. I also understand that many of you have read it, and, so if this is boring, just heckle me or throw tomatoes, whatever it is. And I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. Given where we are and the name of this series, I want to begin with Walter Rodney himself, a graduate of this very institution, as many of you know, an institution which was described by Lord Curzon as part of the necessary furniture of empire. I always wondered what the other furniture was in this whole room. Now, on October 12th, 1968, at the Congress of Black Writers in Montreal, Rodney addressed the assembled with a speech entitled African History in the Service of Black Liberation. You may have read it. It was originally, I think, in Groundings of My Brothers, with my brothers, but you can also find it elsewhere. Let me quote him at length. What you will find is this. In fact, it's happening already. Rockefeller, who's making most of his money out of South African gold, out of the rand, out of the exploiting and participating in apartheid, the most vicious racial system in the world, that guy is going to finance a chair in African history. That's the type of contradiction. So that if a Black progressive thinks he's doing something by going into African history, using up a Rockefeller grant, all he's doing is forgetting both the domestic and external implications of American capitalism and, in fact, supporting that system, because the guys don't mind if you go in a library or a museum and lock yourself up all day. That's wonderful. Keep you off the street, keep you out of the struggle. At the very end of his remarks, he extends this point. The guy oppresses you, and then he selects your terms of reference for you. Even when you're fighting him, you use his terms of reference. But what I'm trying to suggest here is that we have to break out from those terms of reference. Right? This is Rodney. I begin with Rodney not only to honor the occasion, but because it speaks in a precise and eloquent manner to two of the questions I try to deal with in this book, or at least problems within which I tried to ask questions. First was the condition which all of us in this room labor under, the production of knowledge in a profoundly unequal world, wherein certain forms of knowledge are propped up by an infrastructure of distribution and dissemination, while other forms of knowledge are actively co-opted, corrupted, maligned, and indeed annihilated. The second question emerges from the problem of how we then produce knowledge, again, for liberation, rather than for domination. How do we break out of those terms of reference, as Rodney calls them, reluctantly bequeathed to us? This book, emerges from certain desires to connect Arab history to the world beyond the West, especially to South Asia and the Indian Ocean, to read closely the Urdu archive, to link the Nahda to the history of decolonization, but it also emerged from a series of frustrations, chief among them the way Arab thought circulated or didn't in Western academic discourse. I grew frustrated, for example, with how people like Walter Mignolo or Susan Buck-Morss posited the Egyptian intellectual Sayyid Qutb as the paradigmatic Arab critic of Western mores and American imperialism. They did so without asking how Qutb, at the expense of countless other intellectuals of his generation from across the Arab world, arrived to them in English in the first place. If they did, they might learn that Qutb's Social Justice in Islam was the very first book published by the American Council of Learned Societies, or the ACLS, Near Eastern Translation Program, which aimed to make Americans, in their words, aware of the concepts and ideologies by which the thinking and attitudes of the various peoples of the Near East are molded, unquote. The ACLS's efforts were funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and made possible by Aramco's commitment to buy enough copies to cover the costs. Any history of decolonization's ideas must, Rodney reminds us, seek sources beyond those directly forged by the infrastructure of American imperialism, I think. I should note, of course, that my own work, right, is structurally, even methodologically imperial, right? There's no denying that, right? I'm only able to do this work by virtue of my American passport, my ability to travel, the largesse of American universities. There is also an imperial method inherent in this, and we can talk about that. So what I try to do in this book is account, as I put it in the book itself, for anti-imperialism's forms of knowledge. Of course, Forms of Knowledge is all Bernard Cohen. I really like that book. If you haven't read it, I think it's still worth reading. In fact, people forget, but in the first chapter, he ends with a discussion of the US and US imperialism. Post-colonized social science and third world study. In the book, I search for the history of those attachments, affiliations, solidarities, movements, meetings, and revolutions made under the banners of Asia, of Africa, of the colored races and peoples of the three continents, and the damned of the earth. I argue that we must pay close attention to the intellectual project of decolonization, not only because it may serve us still today, but because it was indeed foundational to anti-imperialist projects. And I try to move beyond standard accounts of decolonization as an account of great men, and I could have moved further beyond, and many people do. I offer a social history of ideas attuned to a set of marginalized, untranslated, undigested intellectuals and their location in a history of political decolonization that has been caricatured and maligned, and is actively maligned even as we speak. Rather than simply focus on party men and politicians, the book is attuned to poets, to academics, autodidacts, whose work has gone largely uncirculated and unacknowledged. And for the feminists that I study, their position already at the edges of colonial society's institutions of knowledge only sharpened their critique of its foundations. My book tries to capture the omnivorous reading practices and relentless pragmatic attachments to social, cultural, and political activity that characterized nationalist intellectuals who sought to serve an international cause. The book consists of 5 core chapters: Empire, Islam, Asia, non-alignment, and area. The first part of the book examines the intellectual history of imperialism, anti-imperialism, and pan-Islamism. The second half tracks how political formations like Pan-Africanism, Pan-Asianism, and non-alignment were translated into projects of knowledge production in the aftermath of empire. At the book's center are the partitions of British Palestine and British India. And this is the space of the study. Now, what I try to do in the book is track the political and social transformation that brought us from the colonial disciplines of the 19th century to the imperial eras of the 20th. I seek to narrate this intellectual history through the lives of the colonized. The book highlights critically but honestly, the distance between knowledge for liberation and knowledge for domination. We may recall Emanuel Wallerstein's realization upon arriving in anti-colonial Africa the different mentalities of European colonials and their African subjects. It did not take long, he put it, to realize that not only were these two groups at odds on political issues, but that they approached the situation with entirely different sets of conceptual frameworks. This is in the first volume of the Modern World System. In the first few pages, he makes this point. So I try to trace the role played by missionary institutions, by colonial administrators, or imperial formations in shaping anti-imperialist thought, and I track efforts by Asian intellectuals to build a language, then ideas, and finally institutions of solidarity. To that end, the book draws upon a large body of writing, archives, missionary, national, imperial, colonial archives, periodicals of all kinds, lots and lots of periodicals, official reports, and the proceedings of conferences. Indeed, conferences are one of the key sites of this book's study. And of course, manuscripts and books and memoirs and all those sorts of things, history and poetry. And I'll make another plug for periodicals to all the students in the room. Just, you don't have to go to, the National Archives of whatever state. Go to the basement of the library or whatever. You will find tons and tons and tons of stuff that, a lot of people are forgetting about. So if you want all the details of all that, it is, in the book, as it were. But since I only have a little bit of time, I'm just going to give you some of the conclusions, which are also in the book, but, for those of you who didn't do the reading, I'm going to help you out. Now, after looking at all this stuff and also spending a lot of time in the British Library and British Archives and all that stuff that I didn't actually end up using, I, tried to conclude some things. You may disagree. Now, I wanted to try, and I also tried to make this basically, what I'm going to say here was, in a sense, the title is very nice and the picture on the cover, I chose it and I really want, but the book is neither about Fedayeen, nor does it provide, a political history of, the relationship between Palestine and India. But the editors in the press were not keen on a title that was like, preliminary thoughts on the intellectual history of, XYZ. So they weren't down with that. So once you get the catfishing with the cover. So, but this is what I wanted to, in fact, if I could have just put all this on the cover, I would have. So I decided there's probably three key elements to anti-colonial thought. And please feel free to cut me off if I go over time. I forgot to time myself. The first thing is the task, recognized from the moment of colonization and elaborated ever since, that imperial knowledge is a lie. In a 1939 essay, C.L.R. James concluded simply, after cataloging some of the myths propagated about Africans in Western histories, that all of this, from beginning to end, is lies. Nearly every effort of historical reconstruction emanating from the colonies would be prefaced by a similar maneuver, would by necessity elaborate such a criticism. This was an abolitionist project, an effort to abolish the epistemology of colonialism. Sometimes this was done systematically or with regard to a specific thinker or body of knowledge. We may draw a straight line from Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani's rebuttal to Ernest Renan and Journal de Débat to Abdullah al-Arawi's critique of Gustav von Grunbaum in his Crisis of the Arab Intellectual. Often, this critique of European knowledge was haphazard, not necessarily in response to a scholarly argument, but a political proposal or a legal claim. It could even be a handful of verses in a newspaper, like Wadi al-Bustani's 1918 response to the Balfour Declaration, printed upon the front page of a Palestinian paper. Beyond the scholarly convention of rehearsing earlier works' limits or flaws, the Third World intellectual is inextricably bound to activities beyond the page. To quote Walter Rodney again, as he put it in relation to the bourgeois historical interpretations of the Russian Revolution, quote, "This is not a mere academic debate. It is a matter of life and death." So how did they counteract these spurious theories and histories the answer was often in their own institutions, their own periodicals, departments, institutes, or colleges. And this brings us to the second characteristic of anti-colonial thought, which was the constructivist project to build a new world. This is not to say that institutions for the elaboration and propagation of knowledge did not exist before Europe. There are, of course, deep traditions of philosophy, philology, history, and geography across Asia and Africa. But we were bequeathed, at the cost of our own institutions, a set of schools and institutes attached to the Christian missionary enterprise and the companies, armies, and states of the European capitalists. Beginning in the 19th century and accelerated in the middle of the 20th was a concentrated effort to produce new knowledge beyond the imperial frame. In Beirut, Boutros al-Bustani's National School, and in Jerusalem, Khalil al-Sakakini's Constitutional School were deliberately conceived alternatives to the sectarian missionary schools in their midst. Meetings provided the opportunity to make these efforts collaborative. If the Congress of Berlin in 1878 and the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 represented the high points of imperial arrogance and the profound exclusion of the world majority, Afro-Asian conferences like the Black Writers' Congress of 1956 modeled a different relationship. Now, at the opening session of 1955 Asian African Conference in Bandung, which of course is well known, Khalid al-Azam, then Syrian foreign minister, and sometimes Syrian prime minister, back and forth a little bit, registered the difference that Bandung represented. Quote, international conferences have become a daily occurrence, but this conference of ours is unique in the eyes of history. By its very nature, its very objectives, and by its very name, our conference stands without parallel and without precedent. Here is an assembly that meets not to establish a balance of power, not to divide spoils, and not to draw new maps for homelands or people. We come to bury the evils and not to praise them. Sites of study in the wake of these kinds of meetings came to be conceived in internationalist terms as well. The first Afro-Asian Solidarity Conference in Cairo in 1958 recommended that an international university of Afro-Asian studies be established. And there was indeed a sort of Institute of Afro-Asian Studies in Delhi. George Lamming, in The Pleasures of Exile, wrote, "We need an Institute of African and Oriental Studies right in the heart of Port of Spain." Finally, the major distinction, the fundamental one, is an explicit attachment between the scholarly enterprise and the political and social project, whether nationalism or anti-imperialism or communism or Pan-Africanism or non-alignment. While white social science has sought to deny the ways it serves imperialism, anti-colonial knowledge has not had such a complex. The building of an infrastructure for knowledge production was not simply for the sake of knowledge production itself, but for genuine liberation. The real and imagined politics of anti-colonial knowledge has lasting implications, I think, for how historians of the non-West practice their discipline today. Now, the activities of Israeli academics in the Afro-Asian world, in but not of it, are particularly useful for examining this point. Israelis, famously excluded from Bandung in 1955, were present in considerable numbers at two more academic meetings that were nonetheless politically significant: the 1963 Africanist Congress in Accra and the 1964 Orientalist Congress in Delhi, which you may have read about at length in the chapter 5, which was circulated. Now, the reports on these events are revealing. A month after the Congress, at the meeting of the Israeli Oriental Society in Jerusalem, Oriel Hod, an Israeli diplomat turned Ottomanist from the Hebrew University, presented his reflections. Published later in the Society's journal, HaMizrach HaChadesh, or the New East, Hod's remarks are revealing of the persistence of colonial condescension. I quote, "Convening a Congress of Orientalists in an Eastern country has merits, such as the opportunity to see an Eastern country up close. However, one should not ignore the great shortcomings arising from it either. In India, there was quite a large number of amateurs among the Indian lecturers, people with a good traditional education, but pre-scientific, whose lectures sometimes had an apologetic tone," unquote. Hod would expand his point. He continues, "We have largely adapted to Western research methods. In relation to many people from Asian and African countries, we are freer from an excessive emotional attachment to the subjects of our research, unquote. Other participants in that meeting in Jerusalem emphasized that their contributions were in fact considered the best and complained about their exclusion from the organization of the Congress and the lamentable inclusion of Arabs in the Orientalist Secretariat. In his report for HaMizrah HaChadesh on the Upper Congress, Pitzach Shinar expounded at length on the presence of Arabs and Muslim Africans in the conference, and complained too about what he saw as their defensive positions. Israeli intellectuals distanced themselves from their anti-colonial neighbors, and for good reasons. And distance towards them prevailed in turn. Reporting on the conference for New Outlook, Amnon Kapliak observed, quote, a certain coolness prevailed towards the Israelis as a body during that Delhi meeting. The forced disappearance of the political, perhaps the principal aspiration of Cold War social science in the global North, served to mask a political opposition to projects of liberation, including projects of knowledge production located in the global South, to use, awkward phrasing. Historical studies of the social sciences in the non-European world have focused principally on their enlistment in two distinct political projects, the Colonial Archive and National Space. Two distinct political projects, colonial conquest itself and national state-making, is what I meant to say. In departing from the colonial archive and national space, this book seeks to narrate how the locations and formations of scholarly inquiry were marked by global conditions in internationalist political movements, I hope. So where does that leave us? What are Afro-Asians defending against? We may turn to what Khalil Nakhla and Elia Zereik wrote in the preface of their important 1980 volume, The Sociology of the Palestinians. I quote, unlike Western-generated normal sociology, a sociology of the Palestinians is a native or indigenous sociology. It must be attached, committed, and action-oriented. It must anchor itself in the persistent re-examination and demystification of Western-generated conceptual frameworks towards groups, communities, and societies who do not subscribe to the dominant mode of thought. It is not merely a sociology of domination, but an analysis of the methods and theories of dissolving domination. Thus, they conclude, a sociology of the Palestinians at this juncture in history must be a sociology of radical socio-cultural change, however violent and abrupt it may prove to be. So the challenge we face now, that was a quote, the challenge we face now is enormous, because the decolonization of knowledge cannot be separated from all those other realms that have been colonized. In the wake of partition, those of us condemned to the areas of area study must seek, I think, some solidarity. The Central Library at the Al-Azhar University in Gaza, which was destroyed now 2 years ago, was named after Jawaharlal Nehru, as it was built with funds provided by the Indian government in 2015. Meanwhile, Modi's government has renamed the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, the largest archive of post-independence political documents in India, the Prime Minister Museum and Library. That same government is the largest purchaser of Israeli arms. My book, as any, is an attempt to grapple with our present as much as it seeks to reveal how we arrived there. I've sought to do justice to anti-imperialist thought by critically evaluating its promises and its limits. At the meeting of the UN's Commission on the Status of Women in 1949 in Beirut, which is geographically and chronologically at the center of this book, Anbar Elhalaby asked a question with which we still contend. Will the women, we may wonder, meet with a greater measure of success where men have failed, to draw the nations closer together, to put an end to the policies whose foundations rest on racial philosophies and whose objectives center in exploitation and oppression? Salam Elhalaby articulated the same demand as many other intellectuals I examine in the book, Feminist and Not. That her questions remain relevant now and could be posed to many of the other intellectuals that I discuss is a testament both to her brilliance, but also to the work that must be done now. Against novelty, then, scholarly practice and intellectual culture in North America and Europe needs to practice some humility, not just in the face of the past I seek to account for in the book, but in honor of our comrades and colleagues, living and recently deceased, who resist against actually existing colonialism today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esmat. That was wonderful. And it was a true historian's talk in that it took a long 20 minutes. So I'll pass over to May now for her discussant comments. Thank you.
I'm just trying to get the poster back up.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Okay, hi everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Thank you so much, Esmat, for this book and the presentation for today. I'm really happy to be here, so thank you for the invitation. And I guess even though the book was published a week ago, I kind of like went through it in preparation for today, which was great because I've been wanting to read this book for a while. I told Sarah when she told me. So it's an incredibly impressive book that not only relies on a wide-ranging set of archives from like the metropole to India and Palestine, but also, as Esmat just said, including a huge set of periodicals that I think also are an incredible resource for anyone doing historical research. One of the important things I think behind this kind of intellectual project that Esmat does is that the book has behind it an urgent political project, which is an account of anti-imperialism's forms of knowledge production that were formed in and through anti-colonial and anti-imperial forms of knowledge production. So in that sense, these relationships were forged as a result of struggle. In that sense, it's a story of third worldism that attends to the often forgotten thinkers, translators, cultural workers who traversed across the colonized world from India to the Arab world and back. Or Esmat himself said, and he said that today as well, quote, the marginalized, untranslated, undigested intellectuals. And I like that expression, undigested intellectuals, which says a lot about the interlocutors that he chose to write about. So it is, in other words, a study of third worldism beyond, and as you say in the book via Samir Amin, beyond the photogenic leaders of third worldism that we're all very familiar with, and they were indeed quite photogenic. But for Samir Amin, projects like the Bandung Conference, for example, came not from those leaders, but from radical political critique that forged these South-South alliances without mediation from the metropole. But Parting Gifts of Empire attends less to these self-consciously leftist projects that Samir Amin was referring to in the 1950s, and more to those relationships forged over knowledge production across the Indo-Arab region, and importantly, way before what we now understand as the period of third worldism. So the book starts with Bustani to tell a complex story of Indo-Arab knowledge production that were fraught also with tensions. It's not a romantic story. It was fraught with tensions and was ever-changing with the political conditions of the time. So most notably, of course, is al-Bustani's own changing political commitments away from the British Empire when he makes his move to Haifa in Palestine, marking the beginning of his truly anti-colonial period. While we still need new histories of those relationships forged in the struggle against colonialism and empire, including, of course, Afro-Asian solidarity, the tricontinental, and the non-aligned movement, which Esmat talks about a lot in the book, but the book focuses on a rather specific relationship that has not been attended to sufficiently, despite its much longer history, which is, again, the Indo-Arab relationship. As Esmat claims in the book, the field of Middle Eastern studies has a methodological nationalism that has left important instances in this relationship unattended or unnoticed. And I think the book does a lot to kind of address this big gap. In this sense, Esmat's book insists on following the spirit of one of his interlocutors in the book, Clovis Massoud, who you saw his picture, who said that we should know each other through each other, not through others. This is, I think, an anti-colonial history that refuses the metropole as a mediator and insists on bringing to light these intentionally forgotten histories. But importantly, this is not simply an ideological exercise. This, despite being a history of knowledge, a history of ideas, is a material history of those relationships of knowledge production forged in concrete historical moments. The book's urgent political project is in fact stated, I think, in two excellent sentences, if I may do that. First is, there is no decolonization of the mind without attachments to popular efforts for actual material decolonization. And second is, the thought of our anti-imperialist past cannot be the subject of nostalgia or be mummified by the university. It must be a source for our thinking today. And I think these 2 points are behind this incredible book in terms of a political project behind the book. Now, I have these questions along with others, so I'm going to try to be quick with them. Okay, so the first question, they don't necessarily flow very smoothly from one another, but I'll try to make them flow. The first question has to do with class. So many of your interlocutors are middle, upper class, some more radical than others, but I paused quite a bit on the part in the book where you cite a number of people, including Cabral, around the abolition of intellectuals, which the abolition of intellectuals when when colonialism and empire ends, which I read to be, and I could be wrong, which I read to be the abolition of intellectuals in its class sense. So I was wondering, a la Cabral, if the ways in which we can think about culture, knowledge production, and intellectuals, basically, what are the ways we can think about those materially? In other words, what are your thoughts on the organic intellectuals of anti-colonialism, particularly on their connection to things like labor movements, to armed struggle, etc.? And relatedly, perhaps this is, maybe it's related. What you speak at the beginning of the book, or you do an interesting provocation around the question of method. And obviously, anyone who traverses the academic world knows that there's this obsession about method and decolonial methods and all of that. But what you say is that is actually, there's a mistake in people thinking something is methodological, but it's actually something else. So what is method in the absence of a political project, you ask? And relatedly, what is decolonial thought that has descended into questions of diversity without attachment to a material project of decolonization? If you could say a bit more about your critique of methods or decolonial methods in particular, that would be great. And related to this, again, I think this perhaps might be a methodological question, which is, what does it mean to write Palestinian history from the outside in? And at some point you say, it depends on which outside. And I think this is a crucial question that really goes to the heart of the project that you're doing. What does it mean to write Palestinian history, not by its kind of usual suspects, but by others? And those others are not the colonizers, not the metropole. So it's almost like writing a solidaristic history of Palestine, as well as a history of solidarity with Palestine. So what does this do to what has historically always been called the Palestine exception? And I really like how Rafif Ziada and Brenna Banda wrote about this many years ago, saying specificity without exceptionality. In that sense, we can read Palestinian history as part of a global anti-colonial struggle, even if Palestine, like any struggle, has its own specificities. And this relates to what you say towards the end of the book in response to people who see the Palestinian struggle as somehow transhistorical, outside of history. But the whole project behind the book is precisely to say that the Palestinian question was forged in struggle with others, fighting colonialism and imperialism in its different manifestations. It is, of course, historical. Okay. The other question, which is a bit more detailed, but at the outset of the book, you presented us something that would feature a bit more prominently. We see it in chapter 3, Asia, specifically the role of the feminists. So the encounters of the Egyptian Feminist Union and the question of Palestine, this episode was incredibly interesting. I wanted to hear more about the conceptual and historical implications of these episodes. We know that they happened from your book, but what do these do to your main claim around knowledge production? Why was the women's delegation the one that was uncompromising on Palestine? And why were they the ones, for example, that had the political clarity that Palestine is not a religion question, but is a question of justice and politics? And of course, later the men took credit for what they did, and the usual story. But yeah, I wanted to hear a bit more about what do these episodes do to your broader intervention. But also, like the women you refer to are obviously very important women in the history of the Egyptian feminist movement. But they themselves came under attack by communist women for many reasons, including, of course, bourgeois sensibilities, being Cairo urban focused. And perhaps also the same tensions can be seen in the women's delegation, the Palestinian women's delegation that ended up in Cairo during the 36th revolution in Palestine at the invitation of Hoda Sha'rawi's conference. Hoda Sha'rawi is probably one of the most famous Egyptian feminists at the time. So the question is, of course, not intended to undermine these efforts, but to bring in some of the inevitable contradictions that imbue histories of anti-colonialism. And this, of course, also relates to my first question around class. Finally, the book focuses a lot on translators, translations back and forth. And I really wanted to hear your thoughts on the politics of translation. So we know who translated who and when and what are the circumstances, but what are the specific political interventions made by translation? It wasn't simply just translation. And just to kind of give a sense of what I'm talking about, Haytham al-Wardani wrote this incredible book called بنات آوى والحروف المفقودة. It's about to be translated to English, and he speaks about the translation of Kalila wa Dimna, which you mentioned in the book. And the translation of Kalila wa Dimna over the years was done by translators. He's trying to trace basically the political intervention of each translation. So one translation would translate it and add something to Kalila wa Dimna in order to intervene in a current political question, an authoritarian ruler, for example. So basically, translation was a way to do political dissent. So just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. And again, thank you so much. That was an incredible read.
Thank you so much for those wonderful comments. I'm now going to pass over to Nivi for our final discussant comments.
Hi, can you hear me? Thanks to the organizers, to Lisa for a generous introduction, and to Esmat for writing this incredible book. It's a real honor to speak about it today. The book is incredibly rich and populated with so many exciting figures, and it's really gorgeously written. I really recommend everybody to get a copy and read it. Some of what I'm going to say today has quite a lot of resonance with Maya's comments. So, Esmat, you might have some of the same kinds of questions. But I'll just start with what I took most away from the book. I read this book primarily as a book about solidarity, about the role of people making connections and writing about connections that had already existed in order to undo the horror of colonization. At the beginning of the book, in a section entitled Palestine from the Outside In, Esmat writes, and I quote, "To focus on Palestine or even Palestinians is to impose serious limits on the global history of Palestine. Ahmad Faiz, after leaving Beirut, said that after all these years I spent with the Palestinians, I became one of them. It is this radical notion, in the face of constant stream of utterances proclaiming Palestinians' inhumanity or non-existence, that Palestinianness is constitutive of a set of values and practices related to a struggle for freedom that is echoed in the work and writing of Jean Genet, Francois Kesteman, Rosemary Saig, and Iqbal Ahmed." This passage was music to my ears because basically I'm trying very hard to write a book about, well, borders ostensibly, but mostly about Jean Genet at this point. And trying to think through his solidarity with the Palestinians, largely based on 2 years that he spends in the camps of Jordan with the Fedayeen, one of whom beautifully adorns the cover of the book, between 1970 and 1972. Genet was a French playwright and novelist, and he gained notoriety for his criminal activities, his queer literature, and later because of his championing of groups such as the Black Panthers, the Red Army faction in Germany, and most famously of the PLO and Fatah. Genet lived with, dined with, and got shot with his with his compatriots. But he decided not to write anything about them, so about his Palestinian friends, because he said that he was too scared that if he put pen to paper, the Palestinian revolution would be over and that it would be turned into an epic. He does write about them later, 15 years after, when he witnesses another genocide of the Palestinian people in Lebanon. He writes in his devastating piece entitled 4 Hours in Shatila that when he walked through the camps, he was the first Westerner to enter those camps. He pretended to be a journalist, and he spent 4 hours, like he says, that, and I quote, "For the first time, I found myself becoming Palestinian and hating Israel," end quote. He then publishes his memoir posthumously 1 month after he died, called Prisoner of Love. And it's all about, or largely about, his time with the Fedayeen. He wrote Prisoner of Love when he was dying of cancer, but because he wanted, he said, to be as exacting in his replication as possible, he didn't take any of the pills he was prescribed for pain relief. But he says that although he's as exacting as he could be, his representation was always just one representation. And he starts Prisoner of Love. This is quote. He says, "This is my Palestinian revolution, told in my chosen order. As well as mine, there is the other, probably many others." So he's aware that his representation could never be perfect. But the reason he says his representation could not be perfect, not because of the pitfalls of representation, which I'm sure he was aware of, but because he loved the Palestinians too much. And although he loved them because their cause was just and because it was right, there was also something inexplicable about it. One of the questions I've been grappling with was whether Genet, in spite of his commitment to the Palestinian cause, his hatred for the colonial project in general and French colonialism in particular, and then also US imperialism, was as a Frenchman, he could ever be considered a source of insight, let alone knowledge and expertise about Palestine, Palestinians, etc. Because unlike the intellectuals populated in this book, your book, Esmat, he was of the metropole. He didn't want to be, but that's who he was. But I think you do answer this question, and I want to ask you if I've read this right. When you say, and this is what Esmat writes, "The other, as it were, can be approached in a non-imperial way, even as the demands and promises of empire are ever present." I came back to this question of solidarity when I read in chapter 1, Wadi Bastani's poem, titled "We Are All Muslim Now," and thought about the resonances with our chant about being Palestinian in our millions. Solidarity is a fraught project. It's not always straightforward, easy, or even as non-hierarchical and unprejudiced as we would like it to be. But if anything, I read your book as a reminder for us to do it better rather than to abandon it. This project of solidarity is becoming, this one in the book is one of becoming between South and West Asia, the Middle East, if you want, and India, especially Palestine. And it's been tracked brilliantly in Parting Gifts. And it is a reminder that against the scholar activism of empire, your quote, there has always been the insurgent poetics, also your quote, of the anti-colonial. These categories are fluid. India, as we have seen, has chosen the former. Our jobs as teachers and writers in the imperial West, I guess, is to enable, enact if we can to the best of our abilities, and to mobilize in favor of the latter. But I guess this leads me to one question, and it is similar to one of my questions, that although this book is about knowledge production, those involved in these chapters were always involved in the struggle on the ground. You started with Walter Rodley, but this is equally true of all the figures in the book. The anti-imperial thought excavated in this book was tied to anti-colonial resistance. And so where does this leave us as academics in the West with our privileges of class, mobility, etc., living through a genocide today? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nivi. So now we move on to, I hope you all hear me without the mic. So now we're going to move on to what I think is the most important parts of our events, which is when we get to hear from all of you and hear your reflections and your questions. So if you can be thinking of questions to ask the speakers, or particularly Esmat. So it's just to kind of give you a little bit of time to do some processing and thinking. I'd like you all to turn to your neighbour for 2 minutes and talk to them and share some reflections, some thoughts with your neighbour, and then when you finish your 2 minutes, I'll ask you your questions. So Taha will start with that. Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm gonna ask you to wrap up your conversations and collect some questions from the audience. Thank you so much.
Okay, any questions? Hi, I'm Priyanka. Love reading your book. I have a particular interest because you do cover a little bit of my family history. You allow chapter. Because I showcase my great grand uncle. And the part where you describe the incident from the Noakhali riots, I've heard it from my grandmother. She was one of those who was among the children in William. So I had a special interest in that chapter. And I found that I was, parallel with the first chapter, which was Fire, where you're talking about Bustani and how he used his fascination about the empire, and then he writes a very evocative poem about Lebanon. And it was really kind of I didn't know about it, so thank you for having me. But I'm wondering if the account on Emir Shukri that you gave, and there's a point where you mentioned that it's ironic, especially in the dedication of this book, which he writes after the riots and after the partition, when he's dedicating it to his deceased relatives in Noakhali. Where, that's being characterized, that's being colored by communal violence rather than movements. And I'm wondering if you are using that account as a kind of route to talk more about people like Ali and Abwan later in the chapter, because you focus a lot on the Syrians. So how are you taking that route from the study to whoever you be talking about?
Thank you. So I have another question in here. Only one. I had two. Oh, I'm just gonna ask. Again, it's going to be a republishing of a previous question, but from what I gathered from your book, the place of translate, the place of insurgent poetics emerges from the interaction, the interaction between international and the indigenous, kind of, or the move from the indigenous to the international to this, to the global, or what have you, whatever word that we have for something transcendental. And solidarity also emerges in that space. And I said to you before, when we first met, that I found this book incredibly comforting. And I feel like there's something wrong with feeling comforted at this particular moment in time. Because one, Middle East is full of people, there's comfort in finding solidarity among strangers. But Middle East, whatever that is a geography that is full of neighbors turning on their neighbors. The sectarian logics, the imperialism of sectarian identity has turned it into, has broke the geography into a million partitions. And I'm just been thinking about the impossibility of solidarity and translation within the region today, as opposed to the more global and the more comforting solidarity of strangers that we find in places elsewhere. And I just wanted to ask you, like, what do you think about these possibilities of the more confrontational rather than connective acts that is required for building solidarity between neighbors, between political, ethnic, sectarian entities in the region today?
Thank you. Should we take more questions?
Yes. Okay, this is somewhat fun, and I haven't read the book, or I've read the first few pages of the chapter on empire. And the one thing I was struck by, I'm from Bangladesh, I've never really, nobody ever talks about Tagore going to Iraq. We hear about Tagore going to China, Tagore going to Japan, and Tagore's Asian looking eastward. It's very interesting how those trips don't get mapped on, so thank you, I really didn't know about that, and it's interesting to think about why that is silenced. That's one thing. The second thing is, and I guess it's in relation to thinking about solidarities. Surely there are also, I haven't read the book, so I'm sure it's all in there, but I'm wondering about moments of tension between representatives of what we call South Asia and representatives of the Middle East, because in the time period that you're looking at, there's also a racialization of the Muslim that happens in what is India, right? I wonder if that shows, and even the most progressive Indian leftists might have that. And I wonder if you saw that. And again, without reading.
So, I think we can hand back to you. Because enough to go now.
Well, first, thank you so much, audience and Nivi, for your deep engagement. I don't know where to start, to be honest, but I'm gonna try to answer as many questions as I can read from my handwriting here. The first question May raised about class is an extremely important question, because it's a question that this is my primary self-critique, and you guys I'll send you my self-critique, but you can see all the issues there, and I think gets to one of the challenges of doing this kind of history, and I always tell people to read one book. They're gonna read it, and that's kind of about the old social classes, the revolutionary movements, and Iraq. There's more to the title. You can look it up. And for those of you who don't know, it's many hundreds of pages long, and it's an incredibly serious study of the history of modern Iraq at numerous levels, political, social, economic, and cultural, right? And when he's reading novels, he's telling us about wars, and there's tables, and we get a huge sense of what the world was like in Iraq. French historians and stuff will do this like very boring times, but this is about Iraq in an important period. And I'm envious of that book, in part because it was produced under first it was in the right place at the right time, and it was also produced under a completely different political economy in terms of historical research. Certainly publishers willingness to allow those kind of books to be published. This is someone who spent a career at the American University for years, not writing a book, writing this book, not publishing a book, but writing this book for many, many years, finishing it, and then having a second career at Georgetown, and was able to do that, without having to publish a bunch of random articles or whatever, and was able to spend time on that kind of work. Now, this book is very important. What I was trying to do in this book, which is much smaller, and the title that's a little bit different, was to think about two different places, and indeed not really. It's misleading because it's not really about Palestine and India either, and in the sense it's a massive kind of Arabic archive that I'm interested in, not necessarily a national one. And I think what gets lost in this kind of effort, which is transnational or global or national or whatever, is the kind of specificity and critique that you can do more readily and with more detail at the national level. And the only moment I think that the question of class is even begins to be sufficiently dealt is actually in the 5th chapter, which I circulated, in part because it's the most national chapter and focuses most closely on the situation within India and the question of the Muslim in India. And there, for example, you can see the tension between kind of upper caste Muslim Ashraf group of scholars around Allahabad and someone like Nasir Wani, who's coming from a very different background, who's rise into the ranks of Indian academia is through a concentrated state project of raising up people, right? Now, I think a lot more could have been done even in that case, right? And I didn't get into it because, I didn't want to write that kind of book, but if you read these guys' memoirs, there's a lot of personal heat, right? And if you were to do that kind of reading of these memoirs and try to understand that, a lot of that is about class and caste, right? So I think, you should do that, and it is a blind spot in the book. And also, I should say here that, nobody asked this question, but I'll say, I think, I'm not interested in, valorizing or celebrating global or transnational history in any way. I happen to do that here because I was interested in certain people or whatever. But I think some of the most important history that we can read at this moment is local history by so-called amateur historians, people in Gaza, for example, living in dead or writing in Arabic, very serious works of research that are sometimes self-published, like the work of the late Salim Arafat al-Mbayid on some of the most important Palestinian intellectuals in Gaza. None of that stuff gets read or acknowledged, right? It's not sexy. There's nothing in it that is going to interest certain publishers or whatever. But I will defend that type of work to the end, and I think we need to recognize that, because without reading that stuff, you end up with histories of Gaza or whatever that don't cite any Arabic sources, and certainly not the Arabic historiography, right? And one thing that I try to argue in this book a little bit is that we need to think about this kind of work in Arabic or in Urdu or in many other languages, not merely as like stuff to write about, right? But actually stuff that we need to think with, these are interlocutors, right? And this kind of work, if you read the journals, these people are thinking at a very, high level, whatever that is. I mean, this isn't like, you don't just get to say, oh, he said that. What is that? What is being said actually affect our own thing? But I've moved far beyond question there. Well, maybe that's a methodological observation. You had a question here. So my critique of decolonial or whatever, and I don't hold any grudges, whatever. You want to say decolonial, that's I'm I have no beef. Yeah, I do have a beef, but it's not personal. I think for me it's more of I think there is a tendency. It's well intentioned, right? Everyone wants to decolonize. Why not? It's the least we could do, as far as I'm concerned. But there is a tendency in some of that work to, hang on. So, in the rest of the year, it's probably required reading it. It's there's a chapter in there, a couple chapters where Fanon is famously talking about culture, right? And was doing this is actually speeches he's giving at these Black writers congresses in Rome and stuff. which are being attended by the biggest people in, the writing about language. Right? And this is when he famously, to Césaire's face is like, what you guys are up to in terms of valorizing a certain kind of culture strikes me as kind of similar to these white anthropologists or whatever who are saying, wow, these guys, wow, so many colors and drums and stuff, right? And you're not thinking about our political project, right? Or the culture that's being produced in revolution, right? And I think there is a tendency in some of the decolonial work and whatever. I mean, it's so broad now, it's hard to even be specific. And I think there is a lot of really good work being produced under that umbrella, is to focus so much on methodological problems and the critique of Eurocentrism again and again and again. And that you end up with a situation where people sort of grab onto like a certain word in a non-English language, right? And that word is made to do like a huge amount of conceptual work, right? But the thing is, people, wrote books and articles and stuff. They don't just, it's not like there's the way that somehow everyday speech and a particular word that's used in Arabic or some other language is suddenly a conceptual frame, not just a piece of a sentence, which is a piece of a paragraph of a book of a larger argument, right? So I think that's my view. And I'm welcome to criticisms on that point. It's a comradely critique. I mean, I think, the decolonial homies are in the streets too, right? It's not like it's, I think, I mean, I don't know, some, and so it's not it's about a specific sort of way of thinking about intellectual history, or whatever. And cut me off, I have a lot of questions. Okay. So the other question from me was about Palestinian history from the outside, which is in the introduction. And here, I'm riffing off this off Ibrahim Abuloglu and Edward Said, both wrote this kind of similar things about people writing the history of Palestine from the outside, right? And the outside being colonial history. I mean, whether they're Israeli or American or British or whatever, right? And it's okay, we need to write our own history. Which I just said is very important. But I was interested in what the outside might also mean. And so there I was thinking about the huge amount of writing, a lot of which is not in this book, because really this book is not about Palestine and India, but whatever. That is produced by people in South Asia and other places about the history of Palestine, about the politics of Palestine, about the literature of Palestine. This includes translations, right? And thinking about, all right, well, inevitably we're going to have histories from the outside. I don't think that's somehow illegitimate or whatever. So it's just about what is the outside, right? And Said has this essay somewhere about where he talks about Louis Massignon and Ernest Renan. And he's comparing these two sort of French Orientalists. And he's like, Renan approaches these people as a judge, right? While Massignon, whose interests are more geographical, he approaches them, I forget what he said, but not as a judge, there's something better. So I think about that often, and think about, all right, well, I don't know, something about that. I can't actually read the rest of the question about Palestine, so feel free to tell me if there's something else there. The feminists. All right, so you guys didn't read this chapter. But the focus, or one of the things in this chapter about the Asian Relations Conference, which is a major event, let's say, in 1947, in spring of 1947, shortly before partition of British India, South Asia, organized in part by the Indian National Congress, and featuring a lot of people from all over Asia, including a handful of Arabs, mostly Egyptians, and a large delegation from the Hebrew University of Greece. And so what I talk about in this chapter is, the conflict that takes place between the claims of the Hebrew University delegation and the Arabs who are present. And the point that I make is that despite this huge blow up that happens, it's widely covered in the press and so on. Most accounts of the Asian Relations Conference, which to be fair is fairly under narrated compared to things like Bandung, ignore this Arab presence, right? And I think one of the principal reasons that that's done is because whatever, people don't want to deal with Palestine if they're talking about Asian relations, whatever, it's not like in their wheelhouse. But also in part because people don't read the Arabic sources, the relevant Arabic sources, of which we have at least 3 extant direct, accounts of this specific conference in Arabic, of which the longest is by Huwa Idris, important Egyptian feminist who devotes some 60 pages of her memoirs, which were published posthumously, to describing her interactions in this conference. Now, I don't get into this again. I tried to keep the personal beef out of the book, but Huwa Idris, the claim is that she was going to go up, and then Karima Saeed went up, and it was against her wishes, and it's like a whole thing. But what I also tried to say, and there is a missing chapter on this book that tries to take this question of the feminists and Palestine and third world and the history of third world feminism a bit further, especially into the so-called decade of women from 75 to 85, in which Mexico City, of course, is a famous example where a similar kind of blow up happens over the Zionism racism resolution. But this is in a sense prehistory to that very important history that comes later, is that if you, like you said, if you pay attention to these women's writings and the claims that they're making vis-a-vis the men who are there, right? They are being very direct about the failure of the men in this situation and the way they take credit. And I don't remember if I mentioned this in the book, but for example, I think it is fairly common, and those of you who work on feminist and women's history and gender studies will know this for sure, that the horizons of the anti-colonial nationalists who were women or attuned to feminist struggles were always much bigger than the other sort of anti-colonial nationalists. And a great example of this is precisely this conference at Cairo in 37, in response to the 36-39 revolt in Palestine, where Huda Sha'rawi is like, oh, we're calling it an Eastern Women's Congress, right? And it is eventually called that. And Akram Zaid, a very prominent Palestinian anti-colonial nationalist, is insistent on saying, no, it's an Arab Women's Congress. It's an Arab woman. And she's like, no, that's not what it is. And this is, and Huda Sha'rawi, of course, is like, very much attuned to struggles in India and in China and other places, right? And so that's part of the reason that she's interested in that. But I do think that there is actually a lot more that I could have done and that could be done on the significance of the women of feminism in these, and there are people who are working on this in sort of feminist diplomatic history and international relations and so on to see precisely this kind of tension between the men. Well, I guess I should tell you the story. So what happens is that there is the Hebrew University delegation guy Hugo Bergman, famous philosopher. He's like, we're Asian. And Karima Saeed goes up and she's like, these guys are not Asian, okay? And they stole our land, and we're down with Jews, and it's all good, but these people are like, it's like a European colonialism movement, okay? And then it's a big deal, and nervous at the end. It's like the end of the conference. He's like, yeah, they are going down with Palestine. This is what happens, okay? Now Karima Saeed does this thing, and then this guy Abdul Al-Azam, in his own account of the conference, is like, yeah, we protected Palestine, but actually it was
So we'll turn back over to you all for another round of questions. I think Celia has a question here.
Yeah, so I've got a question that's very much a history question and also one that's coming from South Asia and South Asian history. And it's quite intense, so I'm going to try and turn it over this way, so I'm not like directly, you know, about the text. So just you began your, you know, lovely introduction to all of us with challenging the terms of reference that we inherited, you know, via Rodney's book. And you set up the space between the Middle East and South Asia as one that is made a space of partitions by partition Palestine and India. What I was really struck by was that it didn't really go into how these geographical partitions are underpinned actually by temporal partitions. And the reason, and that's where it's quite a history question, and hopefully I won't lose people here. This division of time into ancient, medieval, modern, which is something that historians enact and make hegemonic, and then it is exported to the colonies. The incredibly powerful and divisive role that plays in the politics of India, Pakistan are really well known in South Asian historiography. And you know, if you're looking at the India-Pakistan border, if you're looking at the Bangladesh-Myanmar border, what you see is these incommensurable historical consciousnesses coming into play with each other. And I felt like the only time you give us a glimpse of the incommensurable historical consciousnesses that are at play in Israel-Palestine is in that chapter on the feminists, where you have the Hebrew University guy standing up and talking about, you know, the Zionist narrative of the Jewish people who are ancient, you know, ancient owners of the land and that sort of headed out. And, you know, I guess I wondered that this sort of lack of attention to the role of history in actually creating these partitions. I felt like there was a real potential there for talking about the deeper structures of partition that are actually connecting the spaces. And I guess it was connected to my critique of the people you've chosen, which, you know, the class question has already been raised. But in choosing these incredibly elite figures, who I think are absolutely important, and no one's going to undercut the fact, you know, the argument that you're making, which is what they said mattered, right? Of course, what they said mattered. They are thoroughly modern subjects, and your book doesn't really touch on how that modern subjecthood is a partitioned subjecthood. You know, in South Asian historiography, it's so deeply talked about that. You know, if you're a Muslim in South Asia, you can't claim a Buddhist past. You are a partitioned subject. And, you know, I guess what my question is this because there isn't a parallel kind of set of debates in Middle Eastern history? In South Asian historiography, I think it was David Arnold who first called it the Orientalist triptych of you know, temporal partition. And the people you read, the people you're informed by, are deeply embedded in that historiography. So I wondered why you didn't actually get to those questions of the modern, if we are to get beyond the terms of reference that we have inherited. Where does modernity fit in that? And yeah, is this a result of things that aren't talked about in Middle Eastern history?
Thank you, Samia. More reflections, questions, thoughts?
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you. I was reading the introduction of the library step I was just like, yes, this is what I need at this moment. And I guess I have two questions with each of you. The first one is, yeah, I guess like we're going to select it and we're going to select looking at was in this book, and was abandoned, for space and those reasons. And I guess the second one is about the India being preferred within anti-colonial political thought, and how it has this sort of like outsized space within anti-colonial political thought. And I just thought you sort of showed quite adeptly that, you know, there's some value to that, because I think a bunch of us are quite skeptical about the kind of the focus on India. So how did you kind of how did you navigate this kind of like India focus on global intellectual history and global intellectual history?
Thank you. I think we can, yeah, Penny.
Thank you for the spirit, it was, yeah, it's very thought provoking, and I read the introduction of the 2 chapters that you suggested, and I'm very much looking forward to reading more, especially the chapter on Islam, which is something that I would love to sort of hear more about in terms of, you know, there are many ways one can kind of enter into the question of Islam, but as a way in which regions have been connected, you know, obviously between West Asia and India, but for many centuries. One of the ways in which I've been sort of thinking about this text is as a sort of project of recovery in some ways. So a recovery of sort of different imaginaries of connectivity, connection, which I think works well with this sort of historical moment, sort of the moment of decolonization, but also equally works well in the more sort of decolonial histories that I think that you just critiqued. You know, in your comments on methodology, they're also a kind of imaginary for thinking about different futures. And I also want to kind of jump off of some of Samia's comments about you know, the terms of reference, something that you brought up yourself through Walter Rodney, but also several times in the text, sort of understanding relations on their own terms. But one thing that sort of struck me in that first chapter was the continued sort of mediation of European languages that sort of structure, but even the translation project, right? So sort of Indian text is still being translated from English into Arabic. And I think that for me sort of raises the question of, you know, the continued sort of potentially sort of modernity, the continued problem of modernity that these anti-colonial activists are having to grapple with. And again, just the broader question that your work brings forward, just the conditions and possibility of thought, right? And how, and whether we can sort of overcome them through different terms of reference. And is there something that we can't recover from where we are right now, from the institutional sites within which we're functioning? So that's a question I had. And what are the related to us? What are the spaces of thought that aren't legible to us anymore? What are the institutions that we wouldn't even consider anymore as kind of sites of praxis and sort of intellectual activity? Last chance before we hand back to the speaker. Any more reflections?
Oh, sorry, Sarah. Thank you, Esmat. This was such a fascinating book to read. And as someone said today, beautifully written. So congratulations on that. That's pretty hard to do. I have a few questions, and they kind of follow up on a number of the questions that were said earlier, but just now as well. I guess one of the things that Mike brought up early on is that, you know, you do, when you draw up these wonderful connections, you're also not necessarily always romanticizing them, right? You try to produce kind of you do show us some of the tensions that that undergird a lot of these connections. But I guess there has been a lot said today about thinking about recuperating solidarity in important ways. But I guess I want to ask a question, maybe that's a little bit of an elephant in the room, which is so much of that connection fell apart in very, very kind of dramatic sense, right? After the era that you're writing about. How do we think about that breakage? And it kind of relates to this question of like, if particular frames of reference were actually not, that these actors did not were actually modern subjects in particular ways that then created a particular national frame of reference that made it very difficult to sustain and actually produce a very productive, let's say, connections. What do we make of that today, right? How do we think of that in productive or maybe more lessons? The other thing I wanted to think about with you is the question which was like making me quite anxious as I was reading this book, which, you know, over our lifetimes probably sitting in the kinds of situations that we sit in and having the privilege of particular kinds of educations and knowing what that privilege means is, you know, what do we do with the fact that, you know, we are a lot of us here, the products of a lot of the very frames of reference knowledge production that you're trying to critique here very kind of very actively, and you kind of opened up your own talk with talking about that positionality, and I guess I wanted you to say a little bit more about what writing this book helped you think about that particular positionality. And maybe one of the things that was interesting for me is to think a lot about how as academics today, we have created so little space for the activist and intellectual, right? Whereas so many of the characters or the actors you're writing about are very active, and honestly, some of them are just like really time doing all of this. Oh my goodness.
Well, in many cases, I think their wives were doing that.
But you know, maybe some reflections of yours on how there are also ways in which a particular kind of discourse and frames of reference in academia derive a particular kind of grounding in the active, right? And I guess I wanted to just, it's an invitation to talk a little bit more.
Yeah, I wanted to reflect on what Gareth said about how do we understand that rupture. In fact, to answer, having read that Elhalaby's book, I'll be my answer. I think it's really interesting in the book how some of the figures in the text that you look at, what they're doing is actually reaching across that rupture. I found it really interesting the way that I think it's Ziadeh, who, you know, says, I'm going to India, continuing this Indo-Arab relationship that's actually building al-Masud. That's one figure. And then there's Bustani, who's going to reach for the Mahabharata, yes, through Ramesh Chandra Dutt, who is like, economic stories, Mr. Modern. But it's interesting that the figures that you look at in the 20th century are reaching across that rupture by going to non-modern thinkers or non-modern bodies of thought. And Esmat Elhalaby, on the other hand, is trying to reach across that rupture by going to thoroughly modern characters. It's an interesting tension in the book that your commenters made me think about.
Okay, we'll hand back over to Esmat. We've got a long 5 minutes.
Long 5 minutes. Okay. Thank you all so much for these questions. I'm just going to start talking and then see where the answers come in to the questions, which are all a little bit related. I think to the question of the modern and modernity and the people in this book, I think one thing that I was trying to deal with, and I should say the book, like, it's not like I'm down with everybody in this book. You know what I mean? It's like I wasn't necessarily trying to write a book that was like, look at these great figures, let's do what they did. You know what I mean? I think a lot of these people weren't necessarily, well, they weren't Marxists for that. That was part of the problem. But there is a way that body of work, in fact, precisely one that emerged in South Asia and really subaltern studies, was so skeptical for good reason, because they were dealing with the aftermath of the Nehruvian state and other projects across South Asia of the the modern, of modernity, of the nation, of nationalism, that they produced, you know, critique after critique after critique of Nehru's project, of Gandhi's project, and again, for good reason, because these were projects that were, you know, in, you know, Hindu supremacists or castes and other things, and that was very clarifying. But what we ended up with, and it came into Middle East studies, I think, was a situation where there was this search for, you know, answers in the non-modern or some kind of alterity, and you end up with work, you know, with certain scholars who, you know, make claims about Arab thought, where it's like, well, if it's not Rashid Rida and it's not, you know, Muslim thinkers, these are the only serious thinkers, because they're pushing something forward in this way within Islam and within society. These other Arabs thinkers, they're just kind of derivative, modern, you know, they're not so interesting, they're not worth writing about, you know. And what I was trying to do in this book was that, okay, but these people had some project, and we can be very critical of that project now, I think. But it doesn't mean that we don't try to, you know, recreate the world that they were dealing with. And there is, I think, you know, for example, in South Asia, Maqbool Ahmad and Abdul Alim and MS Adwani and all these guys at Elagard, nobody writes about these guys. You know what I mean? You have a massive Urdu archive. You have histories of Sapru House and histories of international relations being produced in India that are completely devoid of Muslims, right? They're just completely outside of, okay, even though these people contributed a great deal to a modern nationalist project in India within their knowledge production, right? But they're completely excluded, right? And, you know, I got some commentaries, you know, from certain, well, one of my peer reviewers was like, you know, well, what about the Ali brothers and Gandhi and all this? I'm like, you guys already wrote that book, you know, 3, 4, 5 times. And every year we get 10, 12 new books about Gandhi, you know what I mean? And there was a search even to find the anti-modern or whatever in Gandhi. And so, and I know I'm not answering your question directly, but I'm just trying to lay it out. And so one thing that I wanted to think about was, all right, we know that there was something missing in sort of the historical consciousness of these people, their understanding, and we can understand their failures. But what did they do? And I think one reason that the book ends up, especially that last chapter, which is again the most national, looking at like paratextual elements, let's say, you know, the preface and the other areas, the introduction to the translation, the XYZ, is because at a basic level, what they're doing is essentially like German historicism or like American social science. Like the work that they're doing is actually, they're aspiring to that. So for someone who's looking for alterity or whatever, they're not going to find that in the actual scholarship of these people. But what was interesting to me was that their claims for doing that work were the exact opposite of the claims that the American social scientists and the German historians are making, right? Their claim was actually, we're doing this research because we're in solidarity with the Arabs, we're in solidarity with Palestine. So that was interesting to me. And, but I think, you know, I think actually there's other kind of work to be done. And, you know, I remain a acolyte of Peter White, and I think that historians have been, you know, badly served by their attachments to 19th century genres. And I think, you know, my book is very 19th century, just chapters and footnotes and all that. But I think that one thing that we need to do in our historical reconstruction, in our research, is to move beyond this form and try to think about, okay, well, you know, what next? I haven't quite done that here, but I think that is important project. And so I don't know why I'm looking at that. I can't read a single word. If I remember some of the questions, there was the rupture. Actually, I really like that. So I think one thing about the falling apart is that it was broken. It was made. There was a counter revolution, right? There was a project actually to destroy some of these connections, and you know, some of the folks on this book aren't the most radical among the people involved in these kinds of organizations. But I think what was interesting to me was that, and this also gets back to the questions of the modern and the nation, was, these people were interested in producing institutions, right? And they put a lot of effort into those institutions. And sometimes they were precisely because of the form that they were involved in, because of the project they were involved in, these things didn't live up to their promise, let's say, for my own reading, right? So for example, I don't get into this in the book again, because of Hayden White, I made some narrative choices and, it was not all in there. And some of the contradictions and other things are missing. But for example, if we just look again at the India chapter, or the last chapter 5, someone like Esmat Elhalaby, right, ends up being vice chancellor at JNU, right? And he is, derided by the students there, right? We're trying to build a different kind of social movement from the one that he's attached to, right? Meanwhile, Maqbul Ahmed, one of the other guys in the book from Eligar, after he leaves Eligar, where he's running the Center for West Asian Studies, he actually goes to Srinagar, and he starts a Center for Central Asian Studies at University of Srinagar, right? So he's actually involved in this project of colonization in Kashmir, right, through his knowledge project. Right, and that's maybe because they're too much attached to this project. But I think Edward Said has this line in the question of Palestine, and I think it's one of the more radical things he deals with, where he tries to think about class. The one time he did it, right? He really gets at this. He's like, we have this Palestinian bourgeoisie, right, and it's a big problem. And we have this Palestinian national movement. And we're flush with cash because of these allegiances and stuff. And so it's like we're dealing with an issue that's very different from most national liberation movements. Now, our advantage is this bourgeoisie has been dislocated, is separated from its land, from its homeland, right? And so this has a radicalizing effect on them, right? And I think, if you've seen films, like Garam Hawa, or you've thought about the place of the Muslim in India and so on, I think there is a dislocation of the Indian Muslim, right, that is so significant, that has to do with both survival and liberation, that I think makes it interesting in terms of, okay, well, what were these paths that these people took? And for me, I wasn't necessarily interested and there's a whole other book, or in fact, volumes of books that could look at, for example, the madrasas and the seminaries and the students of Arabic and Islam in India, who are actually much larger numbers than these people, right? And in fact, some of them are students. They do a lot of the work of translation and so on. People at Nadlat al-Ulama and other places, but it's I don't get into it in the book, in part because there just wasn't enough time or space. But I think that's another important place to look at, because if you look at their journals, they're also just talking about Palestine and politics, and they're relating, even if it's a more pious or older kind of scholarly project in terms of Islam, they have similar interest in politics. And this goes back to Abu Kalam Azad and others. And this again, to just one more thing about the rupture or whatever, or the end of solidarities and stuff. And I think one point that I try to make a little bit in the book is that whatever the state project was, or the project of the politicians, like Anwar Abdul Malik makes a good point in his book one time, where he's like, even for these non-aligned guys, like it was too big of a project for them. Like they actually weren't up to the task, these Egyptian guys. And I think that actually it's the same case in India and in elsewhere. But what's interesting, and the point that I try to make again, only in a little bit of way, because I'm so constrained in terms of the kinds of people I'm looking at. And I think if you look at lower classes or peasantry and so on, this is even bigger. These kinds of solidarities were popular, right? It wasn't just in books. It wasn't just politicians meeting. It was in the air, right? In a big way. And it still is. I mean, every experience I had, many experiences, let's say, in South Asia, for example, there was some thread of this solidarity, and some of it was going to Nadwat al-Ulama with my broken Urdu and trying to talk to these guys, and then them speaking, perfect Arabic back to me, and like telling me, and when they heard I was from Palestine, all the gates opening up and giving me every scan of everything that I ever wanted, right? So I think that solidarity is still not real, and I think it's it's just a matter of, C.L.I. James got a line sometime in the 70s or something. He's like, there's not a single regime on this earth that I, support. So I think you can just go, if that's a baseline, right? Then you can sort of deal with, okay, well, what is the politics of the day? And what kind of thing can we produce? And it doesn't mean I think we have to be conscious of our location again. And I think sometimes people, forget that, what they're saying is the same thing that the State Department is saying or whatever it is. But I think, there is, you gotta be, well, I want to know what you think.
So on that note, we can wrap up. I think Samir wants to say something in just a moment about our next event, but ahead of that, please join me in thanking Esmat.
So just before everyone rushes off, this is the beginning of a conversation. We want to invite you to stay in the conversation. Next week, next Thursday, we're going to be reading Catherine Hall's Lucky Valley, Edward Long and the Making of Racial Capitalism. Please come along to hear one of the preeminent feminists of, who has shaped feminist history more so possibly than anyone else in the UK. It's going to be an excellent session. Chapters are ready to go. You need to go onto that website there and register for the Catherine Hall event, and we'll send you the chapter and hope to see many of you back here next week.
You can also follow us on Twitter